everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today at our COVID-19 speaker series. We hope that the sun is shining brightly, and wherever you are, we hope that this is bringing you so much fun and so much information as well. I would love to thank everybody for being here again tonight. Feel free while I am talking to put your information in the comment section. You can say where you're from, you can say your name. If you are a CSU alum, feel free to put what year you graduated from, and really just share that Ram Pride with everybody else that is watching tonight. I would also like to thank all of our Alumni Association members tonight. Without you, we would not be able to host events like this. So thank you so much for your membership. If you are ever interested about being a member, we will post something in the comments section below so that you can look up more information about CSU alumni membership. I will let you know too that this is part of a series, so feel free to check out our YouTube channel and everything else that we have been doing as far as virtual programs are going throughout the 2020 and 2021. And this one especially, this is about our 9th presentation too. So feel free to watch those on our YouTube channel. I do want to also thank all of our sponsors for tonight. We have Women in Philanthropy, the Office of the Vice President of Research, and the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. Without them, we would not be able to find our presenters for tonight, as well as do a program that is based around COVID as well. So thank you so much to our presenters. Like I said before, don't forget to check out all of our other upcoming virtual opportunities. Feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, and really just watch all of the programming that we've been doing throughout the past few years. Also, I would like to let everybody know that this is a webinar, so feel free. There will be a comment section at the bottom. If you have any questions, feel free to put questions down at the comment section. We'll be recording those, and we'll be asking our presenter tonight to answer those questions as the presentation is going on. Without further ado, what else I'm going to do is I'm going to put my information on the bottom for you too. So if you're having any technical issues, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a phone call. I'll be able to help you out. I will also put in some virtual engagement opportunities for you to connect on YouTube as well as our other social media platforms. And then we will also be putting in our calendar so that you can see all of the other upcoming events that are going to be happening. Without further ado, I would love to thank our wonderful speaker, Becca, tonight for being here. She is incredible. She is the Assistant Professor and Food Systems Extension Economicist at CSU. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on over.
I can't see the chat box, but please type in questions if you have them, and then Corey and team will relay them to me. It's great to be speaking with you all tonight. My husband is an alum, so we've got a lot of Ram pride. My name is Becca Jablonski. I'm in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics in the College of Ag, and I co-lead our food systems initiative on campus. So I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight, but I'll tell you a little bit about the work we've done as a team during COVID. Luckily, now I'm speaking a little bit, we're on the side of leaving COVID, thankfully, but I'm going to try to remind you all what it was like about a little over a year ago when you went to the grocery store and you saw images like this. Hopefully not too often, and really I think it was only at the beginning of the pandemic. Overall, I think it was pretty incredible how quickly our supply chain was able to pivot. And we'll talk about, really how our supply chain was able to do that and why it was so impressive. But I think that this kind of image, right, and seeing these empty shelves really caused people to think a lot more about the food system than they ever had previously. I don't know about all of you and how many of you work in food and agriculture, but I certainly was getting questions from family members or others that really don't do work in this area or think that much about where their food comes from, because all of a sudden it sort of became top of mind. And just there's no question that the way that we behave, the way that households shop changed during COVID. So here's an example of some data that we've actually started using during COVID. This is from a company called SafeGraph that essentially takes all of the cell phone data, scary, I know, but Big Brother is watching, and it basically tracks where you are going with your cell phone. And so what you can see with this green bar is this is the 2019 information. The orange bar is 2020, and then the blue is the start of 2021. And here we're looking at foot traffic across the country to go to sit-down restaurants. And so what you can see here is that across 2019, there were some blips and such, but it was relatively consistent. Whereas if you look at 2020, once the pandemic hit, right, this is sort of the start of the pandemic. And then once the social distancing measures were implemented, we saw this precipitous drop in visits to restaurants, right? And I think that that's why we've heard about many of the challenges that our restaurant industry has experienced during the pandemic. You can see now in 2021 that numbers are starting to return to where they were in 2019, but really just focus here on this is what happened at the start of the pandemic with the social distancing measures. And at this next slide, I'm showing you the exact same information, but instead of looking at restaurants, we're looking at supermarkets. So here we didn't see quite the same drastic change in behavior, but we saw this little bit of a decline when the pandemic was first announced. And then there was really sort of this, oh my goodness, we better get as much food as we can because we started hearing about empty shelves. And so it went up and then it sort of declined again. And now we're starting to return, but haven't fully returned. Now, this isn't telling us anything about spending. And I think what you might see through some of the next slides is that this doesn't necessarily tell us that the amount of money we were spending at supermarkets went down, really. It was just telling us that our visits, the foot traffic to supermarkets was changing. So when we talk about food and how we get food,
sorry, Becca, really quick, your presentation just switched over to your presenter slides.
Oh, okay. Give me one sec here, everybody. Nope, I really appreciate you telling me that. Let me just switch back here. Thank you. Apologize, everybody. Oops. Here we go. Okay. And let me just go like this. How's that?
Perfect. That's much better.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Corey. So when we talk about how we buy food or we get food that we eat, we tend to talk about two primary types of locations. So we talk about food that we purchase to eat at home. So you can see that's the food at home piece here. And that's really when we shop at places like grocery stores, or if you go to a farmer's market, right? These are things that you're going to go and buy, or if you go to Costco, you're not necessarily going to eat there, right? You're buying the food to then go and cook at your house. And then there's also food away from home. And food away from home is if you go to a restaurant, and that could be a fast food restaurant, or it could be a sit-down restaurant. It could be if you eat a meal at CSU, right? And you go and have a meal at the Laurie Student Center. And then there's this third type that actually does fit into these two categories, but this isn't food that you purchase. This is food that's acquired. And people acquire this food generally because they're low income or food insecure. And so they get access to different types of mostly federal benefits through food stamps, which is officially called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or WIC, which is the Women, Infant, and Children Program. And generally when people acquire food, they can do it through food away from home sources, such as schools. And we'll talk a little bit more about schools here in a minute. Or they could do it through places like grocery stores where they can use a benefits card. But it's important to understand that, at least as an economist, we generally put food purchases or acquisitions into these two categories, food at home and food away from home. So I'm going to talk about those a lot through the presentation. So prior to the pandemic, it was about an even split in terms of how Americans got their food if we look at food at home versus food away from home. So these blue bars are food at home and the red bars are food away from home. So you can see that they're fairly consistent. Food away from home over the past few years has actually increased a little bit on average over food at home, although you can see in times like December, right, probably because of the holidays, our food at home expenditures are actually a little bit higher. And you can see that prior to the pandemic, people were spending about $133 billion or up to $146 billion on total food purchases. But what happened during the pandemic was that actually food spending overall really declined. And if you think about this, it's not that people were eating less overall, but it was really probably because it's shifted in how people were spending those food dollars. So instead of spending food on food away from home, people were now eating at home, right? They were ordering food through grocery stores to have those products delivered, and they were cooking a lot more, right? And you've probably heard, or maybe you've actually participated in some of those trends. We've heard about a lot more people baking bread than had previously. We actually heard there was yeast shortages at the beginning of the pandemic, and people trying all these new kinds of recipes that maybe previously they didn't have time to do. So when we look at year over year spending for June, so if we compare June 2020 spending to June 2019 spending, actually food spending was 12 billion less overall. And as I said, it's because people are spending less eating out at restaurants, for example, and it's cheaper to purchase those products, the same sort of food, and cook it at home. As of November 2020, food spending had returned somewhat, but it was almost 7 billion less still than it had been in November of 2019. And you can see that actually food away from home spending actually rebounded in July through October when there was a lessening of restrictions, and then restrictions tightened again. And so we saw that the food away from home declined again. Now we're seeing it's returning, right? People are very excited to go back and eat out, as I'm sure all of you are. So another thing that we saw during COVID is that it really accelerated online grocery trends. So online grocery shopping was starting to happen, but it wasn't happening at the pace that it then started happening during COVID. So if you look at this purple dotted line here, this is sort of what people were expecting in terms of the trends prior to COVID for online shopping behavior. But you can see that instead of being about 4.3% of food expenditures, we actually went up to 10% in online sales. And if you look at how our grocery stores are doing, even though actually grocery store sales at the store actually declined, that they were able to really grow, driven by e-commerce. And that was important. And so that I'm sure all of you have probably done more online shopping than you expected, including of your groceries, which is something that maybe you didn't do prior to the pandemic. So we saw that these changes were starting to happen, and there were a lot of questions at the beginning pandemic about what this would mean for Coloradans. So Blake Naughton, and if you haven't come across Blake yet, Blake is our new Vice President for Engagement and Extension. So he's the head of Extension and also of CSU Online and other things. He established the Colorado State University Task Force on Colorado Food Supply. And the reason was that the Commissioner of Agriculture and the governor and the Colorado legislature were asking a lot of questions, right? They were hearing from their constituents who were seeing those pictures of the empty store, of the empty shelves, and they were like freaking out. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And so we were trying to provide very rapid response research. And I was able to lead this task force and thinking about, well, what do we know? What are the impacts going to be? Where are there places where we need policy support or additional funds? Who's going to be impacted, and answering all of those kinds of questions. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything that we did today, but I do want to cover parts of it. And if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to go and visit our website where we continue to populate lots of information. It's foodsystems with an s.colostate.edu, and then you can navigate over to our COVID-19 website. So first is that we tried to provide resources. There was a ton of information that was coming. There was a lot of new funding opportunities, different things that farmers and ranchers had to be aware of, people who were low income or newly low income because they lost their jobs. They were looking for access to resources, food industry. And so we tried to provide this information in a one-stop shop location. We also tried to quickly provide some policy briefs because there was a lot of fear and concern about sort of who was going to be impacted by different types of funding that was being made available at both the state and federal level. And so we needed to provide some really rapid response research. And actually, one of those policy briefs that was requested very early on in the pandemic was to support the CARES Act. The Senate Ag Committee was really trying to debate about how they were going to provide support to farmers, what types of support farmers and ranchers needed. And if any of you work in agriculture, you might know that we have pretty good data for commodities. And when I talk about commodities, I mean when you go and buy beef in the grocery store that's labeled choice or prime, it's not really heavily what we would call differentiated, right? So you don't know whose ranch or feedlot that came from. You don't really know much information about that except that it's going to be a high quality product that adheres to certain food safety protocol. But the Senate Ag Committee was really wondering about, well, what about some of these farms and ranches that are selling through what we're calling these differentiated markets? And especially they were thinking about, what about through some of these local food markets? And these tend to be smaller and mid-scale farms and ranches that are selling. And so they asked us to put together really quickly a policy brief on what did we think were going to be the impacts of COVID-19 on these farms and ranches selling through local food markets. And so early on in the pandemic, we provided this information to the Senate Ag Committee. We estimated that there was going to be of a loss of up to $1.32 billion from March to May 2020. Of course, this shows you how naive we were at the time because we thought, oh, by May, this is going to definitely be over. And now we're May a year later, which is hard to believe. But actually, because of some of this work, they actually did integrate special programs to support local and regional producers. So we were excited that the research we were doing was actually used at the federal level. We also tried to provide some data platforms. There was a lot of questions, especially talking about essential workforce. And so that's probably a term that you heard during the pandemic. It was covered pretty heavily in the news. So when we talk about essential workforce, these are people who work in grocery stores or at hospitals, right? Places where people really needed them to continue to work, to provide sort of basic support and services to Coloradans as well as people across the country. And so what we tried to look at, and this was really led by my colleague Jude Baham, is what is the labor force risk, for example? So how many of the people who are considered essential workers are at high risk for COVID? And they could be at high risk because they had pre-existing health conditions, or they could be high risk because they're older. And so tried to provide some of that information. And we also, and Jude again led this piece too, tried to provide some information around childcare needs. So for those essential workers, we knew that they have kids. And some of those kids are under an age where they can't stay home by themselves. And so they were going to need childcare support, even though many of our schools, for example, were closed. And so the governor did provide some emergency funding, but really didn't have a sense of what the level of childcare needs were. And so we provided some of that information. And just to kind of give you a sense, if we actually zero in here to look at Colorado, here I'm actually just looking at the food system industry. So these are essential workers in the food sector. And so here we were trying to show on a county by county basis where we actually had higher levels of at-risk workers. And of course, this turned out to be a really significant challenge because you probably heard about some of the challenges that were experienced, particularly at some of the meat processing plants early on in the pandemic. The meat plants were able to respond to this pretty quickly, but early on in the pandemic, this was a major issue because those plants are not necessarily designed to have people working 6 feet apart. And so anyway, this was a very hot topic, and we tried to provide support to think about, okay, how do we actually make sure that these plants can stay open, which we needed to be able to do so that we didn't see those empty storefront or those empty shelves at our grocery stores. But at the same time, we want to make sure that those workers are protected. So you might have also heard about dumping early on in the pandemic, right? In part because of some of the closures around some of those meat processing plants and other sectors. We heard a lot about dairy. Colorado did not experience much dumping. And I think that's an important point. The dumping was not experienced universally around the country. It was really experienced unevenly. So for example, some places that had harvest seasons that were going on in March and April before they could quickly pivot, especially products that were destined for the food service industry, right? Places like universities that had then shut down. Some of those products were dumped. And then places where there were challenges then in processing, those were dumped. But in Colorado, we're really fortunate. We have some pretty large scale processors that were able to handle the product still, like Loprino Foods, which is the largest processor of mozzarella cheese in the world. And so they were able to continue to take different dairy products, for example. They did experience some challenges on the other end. So they produce a lot of the mozzarella for food service or for places like Pizza Hut. Pizza Hut, I think, did pretty well during the pandemic, but food service was closed. And so what ended up happening was the dairy industry really got together and said, well, how can we provide support if we have this excess product that's being processed? And so they made a significant number of donations to food banks and others that needed support during that time. So I've gotten a lot of questions about how farms and ranches were impacted by the pandemic. And, I think one of the things in Colorado is that we really got hit by this double whammy of the pandemic and the drought, right? And then the drought, of course, which caused the fires. And so I would say, actually, when I talked to most of our farms and ranches, that they were more concerned about the drought and then the fires than they were about the pandemic. But the pandemic certainly did cause confusion, about thinking about PPT. I'm sure you heard about that. PPE, the protective equipment at the beginning of the pandemic that was in short supply. And so there's a lot of confusion around differences around food safety protocol. But I think overall, really thinking about the drought and some of the other emergencies as sort of having a bigger overall effect. That being said, there were some studies that came out early in the pandemic that were estimating some of the losses that were estimated to the beef industry, for example, particularly when those closures for the meat processors started to hit. So one study that actually came out of Oklahoma State and Kansas State estimated a $13 billion economic impact to the industry nationally. And as you can see, based on where we have some of the biggest ag counties, and of course, we're a cattle state, that really might have had a bigger impact in some places and for some ranches as well as feedlots. But even with some of those challenges, there were also some new opportunities. And so early on in the pandemic, which you can see here by these dots, if you looked at how people were Googling different words, for example, then some of the Googling that they did and searches around some local food, local farm, produce box, CSA, which stands for Community Supported Agriculture, where you have a share in the farm, those really increased. And actually for many of our farms and ranches that had different CSA shares that they had for sale, we heard from them that it was really one of the best years that they've ever had. So in part because of this interest in local food, another thing that we tried to do as part of this task force was to create this mapping and reporting tool so that people could actually find better ways to access information around the food system. So for example, we were able to provide information about where there are farmers markets around the state, but also around where there are community supported agriculture operations. And because we saw that there was so much interest in this, and the federal government also saw that there was so much interest in this, we actually at CSU became part of this national project that's being led by the USDA Ag Marketing Service, and it's still ongoing, although it's coming to a close now. That was really looking at consumer food insights, right? So what do we know about how households are changing how they purchase product? And then what opportunities does that create for farms and ranchers, as well as processors, both in our state and nationally? And so this included a team of a lot of different agencies within the USDA. Also, we have 3 universities that are involved: Colorado State, Penn State, as well as the University of Kentucky. And then 17 communities of practice that represent, for example, independent restaurants as the James Beard, Foundation, or we have the Farmers Market Coalition. We have the Community Supported Ag, the CSA Innovation Network, the Local Catch Network, which represents a lot of the fisheries. We don't have a lot of those in Colorado, but it's really been an interesting group. And we really tried to look at some of these opportunities for innovation. I think just like the slide I showed you around online sales, that one of the things we saw is that these online trends were going up, but it sort of accelerated. COVID accelerated the pace at which those happened. I think the same thing is true for some of the innovation in this space. And we really wanted to document that and understand what that meant for opportunities down the road. So we conducted a national survey that included 5,000 households, and we made sure that it was demographically representative. And we asked about 3 different time periods of their purchasing and different kinds of behavior. So we asked about September 19, which we're calling the before times, right? Everyone's kind of partying and hanging out, miss those times. Then we looked at April 2020, which is when the pandemic begins, right? There was sort of these moments of shock and, and also that sort of stocking up. And then we looked at September 2020, which we titled the new normal, right? This is where we got it, right? We have our new routines. We know where we're doing our shopping in this pandemic world. This shows you where our participants came from across the country. So first, we looked at, for September 2020, how people were spending their food. And you can see from what I showed you earlier, right, that there was actually more spending for those food at home places. So for example, we saw that large format grocery stores represented over half of total spending. Restaurants still represented actually over 14%, but you'll see that much of that moved to sort of online where you went and picked it up from the restaurants. Niche independent specialty stores, a little over 12%. Farmers markets and other direct markets represented a little over 3%. And you might think, well, 3%, that doesn't sound like it would represent an opportunity for farmers and ranchers, right? We're talking about this big national project. But if you think about the 3% would represent about 36 million households, that is pretty significant, right? That's a lot of spending power. Another thing we asked about is if people purchased from a new channel as a result of COVID and thinking about some of these changes. And we found that actually 35% tried at least one new outlet during the pandemic. And then we also asked questions about, did you actually continue to use that channel? So if you started using that channel in April during the pandemic, were you still using that channel in September? Thinking that, maybe that would represent maybe a change that is more likely to continue post-pandemic. And actually, we found that a third of those that tried a new channel continued using that new channel in September. So we asked about food dollar expenditures, right? So we wanted to see who gained and who lost. So you're looking at the blue bar is that first period, right? The before period. The April is the early period, and September 2020 then is at the end. So you can see that actually the total dollar spend actually recovered, but that there were winners and losers. So super centers, right? So your Walmarts, your Sam's Clubs, those are some of the big winners that we see there. Supermarkets are little winners. Natural and health food stores, big declines. And we wonder if that's in part because they just don't have the online infrastructure of like a Kroger, for example. You can see that discount or dollar stores went up a little bit, but the chain restaurants and the independent restaurants are really the ones that have been hit the hardest, other than those natural or health food stores. And so I think that's why in the most recent recovery bill that there's been some specific support for those restaurants, right, and trying to help them out. Here's information we collected about online purchasing, right? So by September, really by April, but then into September, we saw that about half of our sample is actually doing online purchasing. And if you actually look at some of those changes in online purchasing, right, you can see growth between September 19 and September 2020 across all of the different types of outlets. And so even our farmers markets really pivoted to figure out like how to do more online, which I think is really interesting and is likely to probably serve them well in the future. Another interesting thing that may be in line with what you'd expect is that our younger households were more likely to use online shopping than were older households. So by the end or towards the end of the pandemic in September of 2020, you can see that close to 30% of our oldest age group is using online shopping, but it's closer to 60% for the youngest 3 age groups. So we also asked some questions around food insecurity. That's something I think we've heard a lot more about, particularly as people lost their jobs, and then that's been a challenge. What we found is that in our sample, 58% of food insecure households were classified as low income. And you might say, how could you have people who were in food insecure who weren't low income? Well, because we only asked about their income prior to the pandemic at that first time period, our sense is that a lot of our households experienced a job change. So you can see 66%, 2/3 experienced a change in income or job after April. And so even some of those folks that maybe were doing well and they were absolutely fine prior to the pandemic now became food insecure during the pandemic. So we looked at how people are purchasing or acquiring food based on their food security level. So the dark blue is food secure and the light blue is food insecure. And so you can see that the food insecure folks are really much more likely to use every channel except those supermarkets and grocery stores. And it's interesting that they're not using those as much. And I really don't have a good explanation for that. We also asked about time use. There's some literature and some of the research that we do that really shows that one of the reasons for food insecurity is because of lack of time. And so what ends up happening is people who are food insecure, they don't have as much time, they're working 3 jobs. And so they're going to a place where they can just go and get food quickly. They're going out to Burger King, they're grabbing some food, and it's not very healthy for them. And so that if you have more time, that you might be more apt to cook food that you're actually going to eat at home, probably has less sodium and you might use less fats with that. And therefore you might be more likely to be healthier. And you probably also over the long run, depending on what you do, you may actually spend less money. And so here we saw that people who were food secure actually were spending more time on cooking and preparing food for at-home consumption, and that there really weren't any changes in the food insecure populations. There was also a decline, as you'd expect, in the amount of time the food secure population was spending on eating food away from home, right? So you can see that there's benefits for time in terms of the food secure population, but not necessarily food insecure. So for those households who did not have, that basically had, that did not increase their time that they were spending on food, they were more likely to be using SNAP benefits. So this is the EBT, I was mentioning, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This used to be called food stamps. And I'll talk about it more in 1 second here, but food stamps were really made a lot easier to use during the pandemic. There was now a push to be able to use many more of those benefits online at different types of locations compared to people who use that WIC program, which remained relatively inconvenient. It really had to be used in person still. The other thing I wanted to note here is that food insecure households that did increase the time they spent procuring and preparing food were more likely to acquire food at food banks, right? And so, that might indicate that it's just kind of inconvenient, for example, to use those food banks and food pantries, even though it's sort of necessary. And so as I was mentioning, I think that some of these programs, we have evidence that they were actually somewhat successful during the pandemic, like the pandemic EBT program, which provides states with money. So this is what happened after the schools closed. Households who were using the free and reduced meals at schools actually were given some money because they didn't necessarily have access to those programs in the same way that they did previously. So we tried to leverage this mapping tool that we created to provide support within Colorado specifically as well, to think about where there were specific COVID-19 meal sites, because from this national project, we saw that really food security was such a challenge, and we were hearing about that in our state as well. We also really wanted to do a little bit more digging into these school closures. There was a lot of concern because the National School Lunch Program is the second largest food and nutrition assistance program in the United States. So it is a major feeding program. It feeds 84% of low-income, food insecure households with school-aged kids. And for students that receive lunch at school that are low income, and so they're eligible for these free and reduced price lunches, it makes up about a third of their daily calories. So again, really significant. And most of the studies of the National School Lunch Program find that it has a lot of benefits. It's associated with lower rates of food insecurity for households with children, as well as improved dietary quality, so nutrition and academic performance. So really important. And when schools shut, people were very concerned because there essentially was no time to prepare. And schools tend not to be leaders in creating policy around these things, right? And so now schools close and they have to basically make a decision overnight how they're going to respond. Now, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Service that runs these programs did allow a lot of flexibility in some of the programs and reimbursements. So usually, for example, the reimbursements are based on how many kids are actually sitting down and having lunch. And they changed those rules so that you didn't actually have to have kids that were sitting there. You didn't actually have to prove the kid was there. A parent could go and pick up meals for multiple days. There really weren't questions asked. You didn't have to verify that you were low income or low access. So that was really great that there was a lot of flexibility that was provided for this emergency. The challenge was that because there really wasn't clear federal guidance provided on how these school districts and cities and states should respond, there was a diverse patchwork of these kinds of programs that existed across the U.S. And so we did some work to try to really understand what were the indicators of these effective local programs, how the schools responded. And we found that there were three primary things to consider. One was that cross-sector collaboration was important. Second was adaptable supply chains. And third was addressing these gaps in service, especially to increased risk populations. So in Colorado, we were really fortunate, especially in Denver, because there were already strong networks that existed prior to the pandemic, and it enabled cities like Denver to coordinate better. So there could be a food bank and a school that would be talking to figure out who needs something and who has something, and then they could share in that way. There was already trust and relationships built. And that was really important because even though Denver Public Schools, for example, set up these emergency feeding sites, they found out pretty quickly that they weren't being heavily utilized by those low-income households. They're really only being used at about 25% of the rate that people had used the school feeding programs prior to the pandemic. And so they were trying to figure out how to quickly pivot to make sure that they were adequately serving these populations. Adaptable supply chains, right? There were two supply chain issues that impacted the effectiveness of emergency feeding programs. One is that larger networks with more buying power and that were more experienced were able to really get access to food better. And as a result, what we saw early in the pandemic was that actually almost half of the food pantries in Denver closed, right? And you can think, oh my goodness, like these closed right at a time where people needed them. But actually, the food bank, so the food bank is essentially the distributor for these food pantries that then distribute the food. The food bank was able to pretty effectively serve a much larger population with less sites. So I think overall, this was an okay thing. The challenge may be that some of these food pantries served specific at-risk or at-need populations that then once those pantries closed, there was some subset of the population that was sort of left out. The other piece here is that many of these feeding programs depend heavily on volunteers. And often these volunteers are some of those folks that we talked about were the same sort of at-risk people. So they were older or they had pre-existing health conditions. And so programs that were heavily reliant on volunteers for labor really experienced some challenges. And finally, we know clearly that COVID highlighted some longstanding systematic health and social inequities, right? The Center for Disease Control has talked about this, that have really especially hurt some racial and ethnic minority groups and put them at increased risk. And so Denver tried to prioritize documenting this unmet need, but not all cities did. And I think that was a really important thing to make sure that there was effective emergency food service provision. So right now we're actually, we just finished a survey of over 1,400 low-income households in Denver. And so we're trying to understand much more around dietary quality impacts and food security impacts around some of these school closures so that we better understand in the future how to respond in an emergency. So I think that's enough talking from me, and I'd love to open this up for questions. This is one of the websites that I was mentioning for the national project. This is for the, let's see, can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay, I think my headphones did something funny. I was hearing some music all of a sudden. Okay, great. Well, let me just share these slides for one more second. I'm just finishing up here. I just wanted to highlight for you some of the websites where you could go to get more information here. So give me one sec here. I apologize about this. Okay, here we go. Okay, so if you're interested in learning more about the national project, this is where you can go for more information, the localfoodeconomics.com website. Again, this is where we've compiled our COVID resources at CSU, our foodsystems.colostate.edu. As I mentioned, I co-lead our broader food systems initiative on campus, and we'd love for you to participate in different things that we're doing. We have a regular webinar series where we try to highlight research that's happening on campus, try to highlight people in extension. We try to highlight partners in the field, including the food bank and others. We have a newsletter that goes out. So it's a great way to sort of stay in touch with what our food systems initiative is doing. And then also we put on an annual event, the Colorado Food Summit, and we'll be holding our 2020 event in January in Denver, but our location is to be determined. It's a super fun event. Afterwards, we do this really fun meal. It's going to be hopefully with Eat Denver, and so featuring a lot of the chefs in the area, and we pair them with a farmer ranch. And I also just wanted to highlight that I also run our CSU Extension Internship Program. We have 60 interns who are going to be around the state dealing with all sorts of really cool topics and issues. And so if you see them, please make sure to say hi. It's really a great opportunity for our students to get exposed to kind of what happens in real life and try to actually apply some of the research that they're doing. So here's my contact information. Don't hesitate to get in touch. And I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Awesome. And Becca, actually right now all I have is one question. While we're answering those questions, if more come in, I will feel free to ask you one. The first question that we got so far was, what has food supply been like on campus?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that our food supply, I mean, like every other university, we close. Let's see, Corey, I'm hearing feedback. I'm not sure if you are too. If you don't mind muting, that would be, thank you. Sorry about that. When things closed down, much of campus closed down as well. And I don't know exactly if I think we kept a couple places open. But I can tell you more broadly, we have certainly become more aware of food insecurity across our students, which is a really sad thing. And so at first, we actually had the Larimer County Food Bank that was coming and providing support to our students. So they were basically doing a pantry once a week. And now CSU has really gotten engaged with that effort. Rams Against Hunger is where you can go to find out a lot more information about that. I think some pieces of that slowed down just because we had so far fewer students on campus during the pandemic. But it's definitely something that we're aware of and really trying to address moving forward as students return in full force this fall.
Awesome. The next one is kind of for me as well as you. It was just, do we have the presentation slides that we can share with everybody? The answer is yes. Becca will send them to me after this, and we will send out a confirmation email to everybody who is here tonight, including the presentation slides so that you can see them and look at what she was presenting with. Besides that, I don't have any other questions. I don't know, Becca, if there's anything else that you would like to add. I think you did a great job at talking about it, all things food supply, that's for sure.
Excellent. Well, just know if you have any questions, we're always looking for opportunities to, better engage our alumni and provide support around the state. So never hesitate to get in touch. You'll have my contact information with the slides. So, please reach out if there's ever questions.
Oh, and as that came in, one more question that we had is, do you know what international food supply has been like throughout COVID?
Yes. So, and it's really varied across different places. So, it's an interesting thing because there were already trade disruptions that were happening in part because of some policies prior to the pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic exacerbated all of that, right? And so really caused some disruptions in the supply chain. Some places, many developing countries, for example, may be more dependent on localized supply than are, more developed countries. And so some of those impacts have been different. I started to say at the beginning, and I think this is a good time maybe to come back to it, that it's really pretty amazing how quickly our global supply chains rebounded. So I'll give Leprino Foods as an example. A company like Leprino is packaging their mozzarella in these huge, containers for institutional buyers, right, or for food service buyers. And so they're not necessarily the packaging that a household, right, you don't want to go buy 20 pounds of shredded mozzarella, right? You might be a little bit overwhelmed by that and not have enough refrigerated space. And so the thing is that they don't necessarily have the equipment to all of a sudden try to shift and actually put that into packaging that would be better for households that are now purchasing more of their food at grocery stores. And so that's really where the supply chain challenges came from. Not because we didn't have enough food all of a sudden. It's that we didn't have food in the right size packages and the right size containers and getting to the right supply chain for the ways that households were now shopping. And actually, when I've talked to retailers, and this is true, I think, in the United States, as well as places like Europe, if there hadn't been that hoarding that had happened at the beginning, we probably wouldn't have experienced any of those empty shelves. It was really the combination of that quick pivoting, right? And so you're purchasing much more of that food for food at home, and the stocking up, right? And buying all of that extra stuff that I think really caused those challenges. So overall, I think we did really well. I think the bigger challenges were really in that space where now we had many more low-income, food insecure households that we had to figure out how to provide support for. And that's really where more of the international challenges, as well as the US challenges, emerged.
Awesome. We had another question come in. Actually, a couple of people are interested to hear more about the Colorado Food Summit coming up, and they want to share their information, but feel free to shoot me an email at corey.slack@collegestate.edu, and I will pass your information over to Becca. And I don't know, Becca, if you want to elaborate a little bit more about what the Colorado Food Summit is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that one of the things that we noticed in terms of the cities that did a better job in pivoting once the schools closed were those that were better connected, right, and had trust. And I don't know where all of you are, if you're in the state mostly or you're other places, but in Colorado, we've experienced some challenges where there's been a real disconnect between some of the maybe food policies that are being promoted within the city and county of Denver and some of the things that our farmers and ranchers are experiencing in maybe more of our rural parts of the state. So for example, in Colorado right now, there's a few very controversial bills that are being debated in the legislature. And these are really hard issues. And so what we're trying to do through the Colorado Food Summit is to have an opportunity for people across the entire food supply chain to come together and have robust conversations about different food system type issues. Right. And we're trying to think about opportunities where there's win-wins, right? So for example, if we have more population that's food insecure, how do we connect them with opportunities to get access to healthy, affordable food, but maybe at the same time that creates new market opportunities for farmers and ranchers in the state? And so really thinking about, but what are the challenges in doing that? And then what can some of those wins be? But we try to facilitate those conversations in a way that is not polarizing. And that really is driven by some of the science and the evidence that we bring to the table through the research we do at Colorado State University. And then hopefully that can help to facilitate some better conversations around local and state policies. And so that's kind of, I didn't make it maybe sound as fun as it is. So that's the hard part, is maybe during the day at the food summit. And then we have these fun activities at night we always have good food and drink. That's really important.
Well, great. Well, that seems to be all of the questions that we have for tonight. So again, thank you so much, Becca, for doing this presentation. We hope that it was super educational and fun for everybody. And on that note, we can end a little bit early. And thank you again, everybody, for logging in on YouTube. Thank you for logging in on our StreamYard. And we hope that you have a wonderful night, and go Rams.
Woo! Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Becca.